we'll get right to it. We know
Sure.
that the issue of negotiations with the public sector unions is hot at the moment. Where exactly are we? We know the latest was with the government negotiating team and the fact that they had, I think, a period of 2 weeks to meet with the unions. I know we are aiming for consensus. Where are we at the moment?
Well, I wrote to the public sector unions and associations, yielding to their request that a government negotiating team be appointed because they view this as a negotiating matter. Obviously, the government's position is different because this is a unique situation. This is a different situation, but the government yielded. And so we are in the process of appointing the government negotiating team. Now, to the credit of the National Workers Union, who was present at the meeting, that is to say the last meeting that I held with the associations and the unions, that union suggested that we could complete negotiations in 2 weeks. And after some exchange of opinion, it was broadly agreed that a window of 2 weeks would be sufficient because the economy is bleeding. And the longer you delay the measures necessary to deal with the fiscal deficit, the more the economy will bleed. And this is something that I have been trying to impress upon the unions, to get them to understand that there is damage being inflicted because we are dealing with a very different environment. St. Lucia has to borrow on the open market. We are no longer able to source loans from banks and other institutions as easy as we used to before. So they're looking at us and waiting and watching to see whether we're going to deal with our fiscal situation here. And so I'm still hoping that once the government negotiating team is established, that we can keep that 2-week window because we can't allow the situation to continue in perpetuity.
When are you hoping that the team will be?
I'm hoping that we can appoint a team very shortly, that we're in discussions with some individuals who we are thinking of asking to chair the government negotiating team, and I'm hoping I can get an answer very quickly.
Okay, and I know obviously the ultimate goal is consensus. We know that, but if we don't achieve that,
what will happen?
What's going to happen?
If you notice, I've been very patient with this matter. In fact, from the very outset, when we presented the budget to the House, the argument and the suggestion was that we were legislating salaries. You remember that the opposition raised all kinds of issues and cast all kinds of insinuations, and the government did not respond, or the government did not reply, because we knew very well that the budget is no more than indicative figures, and therefore we have a constitutional timetable to meet. And immediately after, just as the government promised, we commenced the negotiations, commenced the discussions. We shared all the economic data we had with the trade unions and associations, and I've gone even further. I've made information public, I've shared it with civil society groups, and we will maintain the efforts to have meetings with civil society groups and to share the information we have so that it can be understood that the government is not being irrational. Yes, it's an uncomfortable thing to do, but it is a necessary step that we have to take to address the problems that we have. So I want to underscore the need for discussion, negotiation. The government really does not want to do this behind the back of any trade union. But what a wonderful thing it would be for the country if all of us can agree to the same thing. And it's not impossible to agree. Just look at what's happening in the region. The government in Jamaica had an agreement with its public sector unions. They have yielded to a wage freeze for 6 years, I think, in effect. They were able to come together. They signed an agreement. The government in Bermuda was able to talk to its public sector unions, including police officers, fire service officers. They too yielded to an agreement. They understood what is happening. The government of Grenada, equally meeting a very challenging situation, is carving out an agreement with its public sector unions. I think they are now on their way to finding some kind of agreement with the IMF for further funding to deal with their situation. In St. Kitts, the unions understood when St. Kitts entered into a structural adjustment program with the IMF. So we have examples around us. I mean, you just look at Barbados, where perhaps the pain that has been inflicted is the greatest. 3,000 persons sent home. Barbados has a very challenging economic situation, yet the unions in Barbados were able to understand and adjust to the situation despite the extraordinary pain that was inflicted on public sector workers in Barbados. So we can find agreement here. We can find consensus. Now, I know it's not easy for St. Lucians or for St. Lucian workers. Why? St. Lucia hasn't had the experience of Dominica. St. Lucians generally have weathered economic storms reasonably well in the past. But this one is a storm with a huge difference. The difference this time is that we cannot borrow ourselves out of the situation that we face. We can't borrow money as we used to before. Now, you will recall, of course, that Pierre Charles in Dominica was faced with an even deeper crisis than the crisis faced by St. Lucia. And in his case, he started off by negotiating with the unions, pleading with the unions, but the unions did not heed his response, and at the end he had to take the very unpopular and unprecedented step of legislating salaries. My hope is that here in St. Lucia we can find consensus. I understand it's difficult, it's not easy for us to accept it, but the reality is, what are the other choices that we have available to us? So I'm going to continue to persuade, to cajole, to encourage a solution, but very clearly, the government cannot allow the situation to get out of control. The government cannot allow the country to continue to bleed. And so I'm hoping that good sense will prevail.
Okay, Dr. Anthony, we know you just returned from
Sure.
the UK, and we know even in the last budget presentation, a lot of the amendments to the bills focus on investment.
Correct.
That's the word
Yeah.
for the day.
I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head. It has to be investment, investment, and investment. I thought the trip to London was exceedingly good. Of course, it wasn't a trip at the expense of St. Lucian taxpayers, so let's be very clear about that. I met a group of about 22 investors, potential investors from the UK, from France, and from other countries in the world, from the Middle East, etc. I updated them on the new laws that you made reference to, and of course the new initiatives being taken by the government of St. Lucia. My sense is that the investment market is beginning to change, that there's now increased interest in St. Lucia and the other islands. I think this is in part due to the emerging strength of the UK economy, and there's a turnaround of sorts in Europe as well. So investors are beginning to look outwards. Now, let's be clear. This crisis affected the working class. It affected the poor people. But I'll tell you, some of the people who are very rich did well out of the crisis too. So they're now looking for new opportunities to invest their money. And it was a good experience to be able to share with them the kind of areas St. Lucia is looking forward to encourage investment. For example, in the energy sector, in the tourism sector, in the real estate sector, in the medical services sector. So all of these opportunities were discussed and shared with potential investors. It's a slow process sometimes. Just imagine the challenges. Sometimes you have to persuade your own people to take certain steps. With investors, it's the same thing. You have to cajole, you have to persuade. I spent some time indicating to the investors that I believe that St. Lucia has turned the corner. That while we do have a fiscal challenge in the bowels of the government, in the heart of the government, but nevertheless we are beginning to see gradual movement in the private sector. I made reference to what is happening with the whole sector. I indicated that when we got into office, for example, there were 3 hotels that were in distress in the hands of receivers. What is now Capella at Marigot Bay, what is now St. James Club over in at Shock, and then of course there was the landings, and more recently Smugglers. The good news is that 3 of these hotels are now out of receivership. They now have new owners, St. James Club, Capella, and of course I understood that the agreement for the landings was settled last Friday. So that's great news. And we have a potentially interesting and exciting investor for Smugglers, which means that there is now renewed confidence in the hotel sector, in the tourism sector. So what we now have to do is to build on that confidence that we are beginning to see in the private sector and resolve the problems we have in the government itself. But I am looking forward to some results. We have to be patient. We have to continue to persuade and to use the language I used a while ago, to cajole and quote-unquote even to seduce. But when I say seduce, don't misunderstand me. What I really try to say to you is that we have to sell St. Lucia in such a way that St. Lucia is truly very attractive to the potential investor.
Okay, and finally,
Sure.
the upcoming meeting in Antigua, we know the backdrop
Right.
against which it's being held. All the islands are complaining it's public sector deficit. What are some of the areas of focus that the leaders will be talking about?
Well, it's a long 3-day meeting.
Yeah.
I suspect a lot of it will be the traditional issues, but there are, of course, some burning issues. The fiscal and economic challenges that face the region will have a prominent place. I'm really required to deliver an update on issues of sustainable development. We have some major international encounters, including the SIDS conference, Small Island Development States Conference in Samoa in September, and of course SIDS to a very large extent is a creation of the Caribbean and of the Commonwealth. So there are a lot of expectations. So we would have those issues to deal with. There are domestic issues with regard to the Secretariat itself and the whole process of reform in the Secretariat. I just pray and hope it's not another talk shop. I guess after all these years being around and being involved in regional matters, I am getting to the point where I need to be convinced that a meeting is more than a talk shop and we can get very rare results and very rare issues. I'm so far disappointed in our regional approach to the economic problems faced by the region. I don't think our regional institutions have done us very well in helping us to cope and meet the challenges of the situation that we have. But I guess on that front, we still have to persevere. It is true that St. Lucia has been persistent in raising this issue, but I'm not confident that the proposal made by CARICOM, or what was agreed to by CARICOM at its last meeting, is the best way forward. I'm concerned that countries are virtually on their own in dealing with this issue, dealing with this problem. I mean, what is happening in Barbados, what is happening in Antigua, what is happening in St. Kitts, look at what's happening now in Grenada. Of a collective approach. Meanwhile, it's obviously affecting trade in the region because, take Barbados, because of the adjustments that Barbados had to make, there's a reduction in demand for the goods that we export to Barbados. We are not doing well in our exports to Barbados because of the contractions in the Barbadian economy. So we all have a shared economy now, and there are real issues. So that's one disappointment, I think, that the region and its institutions have not done as well in terms of fashioning a regional approach to the problems now sweeping the region.